from the heart of Dubai, where tomorrow is being built today, to the world. Welcome to the CTO Show with Mehmet. Here, we redefine technology and reimagine possibilities. With Mehmet, delve into the riveting realms of AI, cybersecurity, and digital technology. Experience the thrilling highs and lows of startups. Immerse yourself in the spirit of entrepreneurship and witness the future of business innovation being written in real time. Now, without further ado, let's tune in and explore the future.
Hello and welcome back to an episode of the CTO Show with Mehmet. Today I'm very pleased. Joining me, Bryan Wood, who's a principal architect at Snorkel AI. Bryan, the way I love to do it with all my guests is I keep it to them to introduce themselves. So, a little bit about you, your background, your journey, and what you're currently doing at Snorkel. And then, we can discuss a couple of topics, of course, related to AI, as the audience can guess probably from the company's name. We're gonna talk about data labeling, like data labs, and compliance, some use cases also as well that you've been doing. I'll not speak a lot. I'll keep it to you. So the floor is yours, Bryan.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Mehmet. Really excited to be here. Like you said, my name's Bryan Wood. I'm a forward deployed principal engineer at Snorkel AI. Prior to this, I spent about 20 years in the banking industry, and my background before that was in fine art. So have a bit of a meandering career arc there. The main focus I have currently is working with Frontier AI Labs to design basically data sets for experiments that they're trying to run. So, kind of figuring out like how to partner with their research teams, bring in our research team and, help them kind of build the state of the art models.
Great. And thank you again, Bryan, for being here with me today. Um, let's start with, the basics of what you currently do, Bryan. And the need of having the data. So what kind of value you bring when we talk about programmatic data labeling and data-centric AI?
Mhm.
So what enterprises or even like maybe a startup are missing today, and where what you're doing currently at Snorkel makes sense to them?
Yeah, sure. I would say that, the main focus we have is on designing these data sets because, as AI has become more capable and more complex, the type of data needed to both benchmark it and tune it has gotten, significantly more complex. And I think, maybe the best way to frame this up is that, we really think about data as like R&D. So we're working with R&D partners in labs that are building frontier models. And, we're doing R&D and we're doing experiments that really focus on the shape of the data and, how that data is going to model an AI agent or LLM's behavior. And so it's really more of like a research sort of angle on data, which is really interesting. I think the main difference, between what I'm doing with labs and how enterprises are managing data is, enterprises tend to treat data as like a byproduct of a process. It's something that kind of moves between systems, maybe lands in a data lake or something, and it'll go through all these data quality processes um, and but data like that's kind of table stakes for data management, but it's not really putting the data in a form that's going to guide or evaluate AI. And there's quite a bit of research and art that goes into how to actually leverage that data, and that's something these labs are like really really good at. And so yeah, my main focus is basically collaborating on those labs of like what do these data sets need to look like, to push the frontier.
Got you. So, Brian, is there a misconception here because you mentioned the model? So, is there a misconception you see still with the teams that you work with about why it's not mainly about the model all the time? It's also about the quality of this data. Is this something that maybe even some leaders are misunderstanding, or they have like maybe misconception about it when it comes to data quality when starting any AI project?
Yeah, I think so in the enterprise space. In the research lab space, I think there's a huge focus on data, a very clear understanding of the importance of it and its connection with R&D. I think in the
Interesting.
enterprise space, though, you do still see some focus on the models. I think that a lot of these models are kind of, sort of harmonizing to sort of have a lot of the same capabilities. I mean, I use all of the models a lot of times interchangeably. I'll find, certain strengths and weaknesses. Um, Over the past few years, though, I had heard several enterprise leaders, that had the position of, the models are going to keep getting better and better. And, we're going to hold off on, tackling these hard problems because, we think in 6 to 12 months, these problems might go away. Uh, and so I think I don't see that as much now. I think more of the misconception recently is on evaluating the models and what it actually takes to get these into production. There had been a lot of focus on just the performance of the models. How does it do on benchmarks? There had been a lot of focus on like agentic infrastructure, which is like, how do you put all this stuff together? And I think what people are starting to realize is the models are kind of commoditized. I mean, you should
Hmm.
pick the ones you want for whatever reasons you want. Probably a good idea to not be locked into a specific family. Maybe have ones you can run locally. So the different enterprises just have different needs there. Um, and so I think what you're seeing in the enterprises that are actually getting this stuff into production is they really are starting to focus on evaluation, which is, we have to do this safely, right? Like building the thing is not necessarily that hard. The models are available, but how do you build trust in it? Which kind of comes down to evaluation. And there's I've seen misconceptions in evaluation where, people just kind of buy a package of evaluations or software. And, that evaluator might say, okay, your attribution is at 85%. And it's like, okay, well, what does that even mean? Does it mean anything for the process that we're running? Do we agree with it? And I think, one of the things that people are maybe starting to realize is that evaluation is probably for an enterprise going to almost always need to be bespoke. You're going to have to define what is actually important to your process and, not just have humans annotate whether it's good or bad, but actually have humans annotate the whole workflow in a way that guides AI so that you have like real data for that eval. And, all that's a lot of hard work, which is why I think you sometimes see this sort of lag in AI deployment. You see a lot of headlines about lack of, AI
Hmm.
projects leading to ROI and things like that. And I think it's because, that, and I realize it's getting to be a long answer, but like, I think it's because you
No,
tend to
it's
see
okay.
these projects slow down at like stage 3 or 4, right? It's like, we got access to the models, we got the agent set up, we got some evaluators, and it all seemed really easy up until that point. And then you sort of hit this wall where, okay, are we evaluating the right things? How do we even set up the data to do that evaluation? And that's where a lot of expertise and, art is required to do it correctly. And I think that's where you're seeing things stall out right now.
Right. Now, you mentioned the agents, you mentioned, the models. Um, and the applications today are like literally limitless, right? So we can apply to a lot of domains. But for example, in areas, Brian, like let's say which they have high compliance, high risk, probably maybe financial services, and I know
Yeah.
you have a background from there. So how do you ensure also the domain expertise is properly codified when using the labeling, for example? And are there any limits to their approach? Because again, what I have heard from experts that one of the main things, like people are still kind of, I would say, they think about it a lot, or maybe they are hesitant. It's about this piece. Like, okay, like how good would it be in something that is maybe simulating transactions, or I don't know, like if you're trying to create data sets for uh I'm simplifying it, of course, but like for detecting frauds, right? So uh, tell me more about your approach at Snorkel, and of course, based also on your experience as well.
Um, yeah, I think the main thing is going to be like you have to actually look at what sort of workflow you're trying to automate with these agents, um, and really build your data sets around that. So, for example, if you're trying to like my background is largely commercial banking, so like lending to large businesses. If you were looking to automate a workflow with that, like what an underwriter or analyst might do in a commercial bank. Um, a lot of times, financial services places, they have tons of data. And it's just kind of like this data that's a byproduct. It's in like a transactional database or something like that. And where they struggle is translating that into data that's going to guide the behavior of an AI. Because you can't just say like, well, we have everything in a data warehouse. It's passed the quality checks. We've got metadata. Our data is in good shape and expect it to really drive an AI workflow. You really need to set up data sets that look like what that person is doing in that job. And that's going to provide the patterns that the AI learns. And so I think that's one of the places, again, that's a very hard problem to solve. And so I think that's one of the places where you see some projects, get hung up because it's like, what does that data need to look like, and how do you evaluate it? And a lot of times the gap there is simply expertise on how to manipulate that data into something that's useful. For the most part, it's something you're going to have to create. You can use synthetic methods to automate some of that, but that it's not going to be just simply backing up a tuning process into a data warehouse. I think that's what I'm trying to get at, I think.
Right. Now, you mentioned also something interesting, and here it's about the amount of time probably I think teams put some time to get things work. So there are a
Mhm.
lot of things that might goes wrong there, and we've heard also about like how data sets, if they are not like properly, I would say, cleaned up. I don't know what's the right word. I'm
Yeah.
not expert in this. So they might look biased. The data might look biased. So sometimes, we've heard about also the hallucination problem, and this is where the
Mhm.
RAG things comes into the play. So do you help somehow also in isolating, where the problem is exactly from? Is it like from data labeling logic? Is it like the model architecture? Like how does the workflow, if
Mhm.
that makes sense, work when you engage with your customers?
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Because the whole purpose of a lot of these evals and the data sets that drive them is to find those error modes, like you're discussing. Because a lot of times, like the capabilities of AI are described as like a jagged edge because there's going to be certain things that it's captured this capability it's very good at, and then there's going to be things that sort of look very similar to that, but the AI hasn't quite solved yet. So and this is in some ways kind of a traditional software development loop, right? Where you're deploying things, you're finding bugs, you're finding error modes, and you're fixing those. And that's a very iterative process. And on the enterprise side, it's one of the main things we do with our customers is we help them set up benchmarks, evaluations, and then basically act on those. Because each time, we run some experiment, update the models, and then re-benchmark things, it's going to reveal something about that model or system's behavior that needs to be fixed, or maybe it's additional slices of data that you need to look at for creating your benchmark. And so it does in some ways. There's the art to setting up the benchmarks, but once you have good benchmarks, it does become a very iterative process of simply fixing the bugs, and that could be done through some of the things you mentioned, like are there issues with the data labels, right? Like is the data just wrong or poor quality, or, is it a hallucination issue? Is there something wrong with like a rack pipeline, things like that? And obviously, like, these aren't, we're not just talking about like a model where you need to retrain it. These are usually like full systems with a lot of different integrations, API calls, RAG setups. And so a lot of the work on the evaluation is really pinpointing where it went wrong. Because these processes tend to be like stepwise. So, if it gets step 1, 2, 3, and then it fails, the kind of the whole thing fails. And if you're just looking at that end result and you're seeing failure, it's informative, but it's not telling you where your problem is. You need to know, okay, it failed at step 4 and it's failed for this very specific reason. And it's finding those specific reasons that can be very difficult if you're trying to use, what I would say is like off the shelf benchmarks or off the shelf evaluations, because they're not likely to tell you very much about your actual data or the behavior of your system. These things are going to tend to be very generic. I'm not saying they're not useful, but you'll have to really set up a bespoke evaluation for your own system, I think, to get a good signal.
Makes a lot of sense. Now, one thing you mentioned, Brian, also minutes ago, is about the ROI and figuring the ROI. So, um, maybe without mentioning name of customer, I can understand, sensitivity here. But if you can give us an example on the ROI, because we are seeing sometimes also these reports coming out in the media and saying like, hey, like based on these studies, like X% of companies they try to deploy AI, they didn't see the ROI, or like for example, they're struggling. So when you speak to customers after a successful engagement with them, like what would be like the major ROIs that they can immediately see? And maybe some of them, I understand they might be on the short run, few would be on the long run. So what are like these ROI use cases that you have seen working?
Yeah, most of what we still see is what I would call like traditional OpEx or operational excellence. It's largely, cost cutting, like find manual repetitive processes, which, companies have always automated processes with software, whether it's, just system integrations, robotics, whatever. AI is giving you a new capability to move, up the value chain on that automation. And I think that's largely the theme. And, ROI can be in the, tens to hundreds of millions for enterprises. So these are super valuable use cases. When you think about the ROI for the frontier labs, that could potentially approach the billions of dollars because, they're competing for, a much larger kind of like long-term ambition there. And and so we do see, healthy ROIs with the use cases we're engaged. I think, one thing I'd want to call out, because, you did mention some of the studies and articles around companies struggling with ROIs. So I'll get the numbers wrong because I don't remember them off the top of my head. But, that MIT study that came out earlier this year is probably the most well known. It said something
Right.
like 85, 90, whatever percentage of companies, fail to realize ROI. And to me, the most interesting thing in that article was the breakdown between companies that tried to do this themselves versus companies that partnered. And,
Mm,
basically the punchline was that the companies that are getting ROI are partnering. They're bringing in, whether it's consultants, vendors, startups, companies that deploy forward engineers like myself. Those are the companies that are getting value out of AI. Whereas the companies that are trying to do this all homegrown, hire their own talent, build their own systems are largely not realizing ROI. So I think what that really points to is, one of the bottlenecks on this is expertise. And the market is super competitive for people that can build and deploy AI systems that have ROI. And, it's largely, I would say, like more practical to try and partner with a company that has a track record of doing this versus trying to build it yourself. I think that'll change over time. Right now, this is new and there's not that, there's just relatively few people with the muscle memory of how to do this. And again, those people are going to be highly sought after. So, those are the people, the companies that you need to probably try and reach out to and partner with if you try and do this yourself, you're going to be in a very competitive place trying to get the people that know how to do this. Um, Again, I think that's because AI is so new right now. With any technology, there's going to be a small group of people pushing the frontier. As AI becomes just part of the stack and everyone knows how to use it, this problem will go away. But I think what it points to in the short term is that companies are better off partnering if they want a cheap ROI. This is something I did when I was in financial services. So, before I joined Snorkel, I was a customer of Snorkel, and
Mm,
I was a customer of Snorkel because they were stacked with, top tier research PhDs, people that I wasn't going to be able to hire or attract for the group that I ran. But that was the expertise that I needed to, come in, think about my problems, come up with solutions and deploy those solutions. We didn't have that talent and we weren't going to be able to hire it because it's scarce. So I think that's the right pattern. And that's kind of like what that MIT, study really revealed to me was that, my instincts around looking for experts and partnering versus just trying to build your own pool of experts is probably a lot more effective.
I think this makes a lot of sense because when people feel the urgency to jump on a new technology without proper preparation, and of course what you mentioned, the expertise is the number one here. So I think this might have reflected on the study of MIT. But as you said, it's very logical to me. Like the more we start to understand more how we can use this, we build, kind of this practitioner mindset of how to utilize the technology. I think we will be able to solve these issues that the study unveiled. Now, because you came from the financial services, now are you seeing, and I know now you work with like other verticals as well, but there are like usual suspects, as we call them, like financial services,
Mhm.
healthcare, the high regulated domains. Are we still seeing this dilemma of innovation versus compliance, specifically when we try to implement AI in such environments, or the myth is not there, is busted, is not there anymore? Like what are you
Yeah.
seeing in this domain, Brian?
I think you're definitely still seeing that. I would maybe want to like reframe it though. Like I don't really think of it as a dilemma or a problem. Like because the narrative or the punchline you hear all the time is that like places like financial services, healthcare, they move slow and they are kind of like late adopters of this type of stuff. Um, I think that's true, but it's not due to, lack of effort or vision or talent. It's generally because, that's the pace they need to move at. They're optimized for, minimizing downside, right? Like minimizing risk. And and which is, one of the things I really enjoyed learning at places like that was it requires a lot of rigor to deploy things at a place like a large financial services company. At a startup, the pace is completely different. We can move really fast. The labs that I work with right now move really fast. They can just blaze the trail. And financial services just are set up differently. They deal with people's money, their life savings, and all the regulation, for the most part, is there for a good reason. Um, so I don't necessarily think it's a dilemma. I think it's more of just the nature of it. But the way that manifests is that the companies are sometimes perceived as not being innovative. And, the way I would maybe try and reframe that is they do innovate, they do the experiments. You don't necessarily see the results because it simply takes more effort to deploy things there. So I tend to think of a place like financial services as healthcare as not where you're gonna see the innovation. It's not gonna appear to be that innovative. It's not gonna be a place that this stuff is invented. So I think of it as more of like a proving ground. So, once AI is deployed at scale in financial services, I think that's the hardest environment to do it in. And it's not hard because of the technology. It's hard because it's a complicated place with complicated regulations. And so I look at that as like the innovation happens elsewhere. That's just the nature of it. Things get hardened in places like financial services because they have to be perfect to be deployed there. And so I don't think it's necessarily that the banks are slow or lagging innovation. I think they're doing what they're supposed to do with the pace they're supposed to do it. Um, and if the banks invested more in innovation, maybe hired different type of talent to do research in places like this, I just don't know that it would bear any real value because at the end of the day, it's the hardening that is really the trick at the banks rather than the actual new technology.
Right. And I think we are seeing more like both financial institutions, banks, insurance, and even like healthcare, they're trying to create this kind of sandbox environments or
Mhm.
labs where they can like try new ideas before taking it as production. Make sure, and then as you mentioned, like you put the safeguards there, like on the guardrails as they call them, and then try to take it to the mass production, which is yeah, I think we're seeing a paradigm shift here because again the AI is pushing everyone to try to change their behavior, and
Yeah.
I think this is good for the consumer. I would say, like for the end user, because it's pushing everyone to try to find like how we can leverage this technology to serve our customers in a better way. Now, moving from enterprise a little bit more to the startup sides, Brian. So I follow this domain a lot, and of course, as we discussed, like now the model is commoditized. Like it's not about the model. We know, like also the infrastructure kind of it's like there's abundance. Let's call
Mhm.
it this way. Now the mode, and a lot of my guests they said like the mode today is the data, right? And the
Yep.
amount of and the quality of the data. Now when it comes to startup they always have this problem called the cold start a problem, right? Which can be applied actually to the data, because at the beginning they might not have enough data to build a, let's call it a minimum viable AI model, right?
Mhm.
So anything at Snorkel where you work with startups and help them in this challenge?
Yeah, that's actually a huge focus of my job because there's a lot of startups, in the AI space trying to build competitive models now, and a lot of that work is catching up to the state of the art. It's just kind of like by definition, startups are competing with bigger players that have more invested and have more money. And so that's where, having like novel research, both within Snorkel and within the labs that we partner with is really critical because you have to have novel ideas if you're going to be competitive in this space. Um, we've definitely heard a lot about data being the moat. I think, you know, catching up to the state of the art though has actually, I'm not going to say it's like simple, but if we had talked a few years ago, I think the narrative was AI is going to be won by the big players because it takes hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to create a state of the art model. So, it's going to be won by the players that have that money to invest. And, one of the things we've been seeing a lot of innovation in, especially like out of China, is like how to create a state of the art model, that catches up very quickly, without those large investments. And, so a lab coming out today could probably use some of those models to create synthetic data and train their model and, do some pretty meaningful hill climbing on a benchmark until they hit a threshold of where they can get, with synthetic data. And then it becomes about, getting those more kind of like expert curated R&D design data sets that start to push the edge into the frontier and beyond. So I do think that like data is a moat. And that's why we see such a focus on it from the labs and building these more advanced data sets. Um, but I think that, as things like open source models, continue to keep pace and catch up with the state of the art, the ability to synthetically create that data continues to advance. I will caveat that by saying, like, there's not really any such thing as like purely synthetic data, right? So It's not like you hit a switch and you have data. You still have to have the people that know how to use those models to create the data that's designed to train the model. But I do think it's making it easier for newer, lesser funded players to catch up, and
Hmm.
is contributing to that idea that models are kind of being commoditized. I think the other place that like data as a moat is becoming interesting, and I've seen some kind of shifts in this, is again, if we had talked 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, hey, these financial services companies, they have all this data. Like I remember saying it in my old job, like we have the best commercial banking data set in the world. So we can build the
Hmm.
best commercial banking AI. And I would have thought that data is a moat. But where we're seeing this go now is that these frontier labs are, basically figuring like they're creating that data now. So, being a bank and having a bunch of banking data is not at this point, I don't think really providing you a moat in building, AI that does banking workflows. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for the bank. I think it means that the labs are going to take the lead in developing AI that will be deployed at banks, and the banks are going to, probably be customers rather than builders in that scenario.
Right. Now, Brian, another thing which startups usually they would have a challenge in is maybe small engineering team. Like, is there anything that usually you can help them with, like to be like extended, I would say, data team for them? Like, is there such offering or services from your side?
Yeah, on the enterprise side, we have teams of forward deployed engineers like myself that, kind of go in, provide expertise, build these systems. And it's very similar, working with the labs that are building, models and AI systems. Is, we integrate with them as both research and data partners. And yet, so we're not only helping them define that data and define the experiments and how to, measure the output of their models, we're also helping them scale their data operations. Because getting, a network of experts to manually curate or augment data that's synthetic is it's a pretty big operation, and something that I wouldn't expect all labs or startups in this space to want to tackle themselves. um, so a big part of the service we offer is in addition to that research partnership, it's like, how do we scale up those data operations so that customers are getting data that's the highest quality and at the volume that they need.
Right. Now, I know like it's hard to predict future, Brian, especially in the age of AI, but maybe some patterns that you're seeing that might affect the way we're gonna continue doing this, regarding what you currently do at Snorkel. So where are we heading in your opinion? Like what would be the next frontier? If that makes sense when it comes to the use cases, like I know we spoke about, for example, agentic AI. We spoke about like the but like something you see it gonna be big for that specific use case. And when I go to the snorkel.ai website, I see bunch of use cases, but the ones that attracted my attention, of course, is like the agentic AI. The other one is coding. So what is next? Let me simplify it this way.
Yeah, sure. I think, just I'll focus on a couple different spaces. First, in the data space, I think we're not going to see any slowdown in the demand for data. Because as the capabilities get more advanced and the systems get more complex, the data that's going to drive the frontier will get more complex and require, more expert input and more complicated workflows to get right. So, if we want to actually deploy agents that do end-to-end enterprise workflows, which I think we're still a ways off from, there's not going to be any slowdown in the demand for, what I'll call like AI ready data. So I think that's going to continue to be a big focus. I think another thing, like just looking ahead, you know, one of my perspectives on a lot of these things is I always like to focus on like what's practical, what can I actually get
Mhm.
value out of in 6 to 18 months. Um, And so one of the things I think is maybe a little like overhyped right now is the timeline on some of this stuff. Um, I think we always have this prediction that there's going to be massive disruption over the next 1 to 2 years, and we've been living with that for a couple of years now. And to be sure, there has been disruption, but I don't think things are. Um, y- you know, I don't think we're gonna. When we see some of these calls for like massive displacement of jobs, due to agents
Mhm.
and things like that, I don't think it's going to happen at the pace that other people are calling for. I think it's more of just to be clear, like all the ideas we're seeing, like end-to-end workflows, it'll happen. I just think it's going to be more in the 5 to 10 year range when we actually see autonomous agents doing the work of, a professional in financial services. I don't think it's going to be in 2 years. But that said, I am very excited about agents. I think the foundation is being laid, the expertise to deploy this stuff at scale is being built up, and I think we'll get a ton of value out of that. I think the other place we, hopefully we'll see some innovation is just in model architecture and capabilities. There's been a lot of studies on there being a bit of a plateau in capabilities. Models continue to kind of hill climb benchmarks, but it's more money being invested, more compute being invested for fewer incremental gains. And so I think, we're going to continue to see progress in LLMs, but it might slow down and plateau a bit. So another place that I find really interesting, over the next couple of years is in alternatives to LLMs. So, and actually seeing some of those deployed with practical applications. So, I'm talking about like models that have like worldviews, long-term memory, ability to do continuous learning. Solving some of those problems, I think are going to lay the foundation for the end-to-end agents that we want to get all this value out of. But I don't necessarily think we're going to do it with just the tools we have today.
Right, and I agree with you. And the more I delve more into the this theory about replacing jobs and all this, so the more I understand, like actually humans will be needed more than any time before, because like you
Yeah,
need you need the coordinator, you need the supervisor role, I would say, because at the end of the day you still need to check, like, are the agents working properly as we are suspecting them to be, probably enhancing the way they work and keep optimizing the way these agents work. And it's a mix with, funny enough, it's like, I- I'm not sure if I might say this. I know, like, some people, they would not like it. Of course, LLMs, AI, machine learning, all this, but there's a lot of things which are automation, which, like, I think it's a big chunk of automation that it's helping us using the AI, of course, to streamline these processes, to streamline, how we do things. And this is where us as human will be needed. I agree with you, Brian, on this
yeah,
100%. Um, and of course, like, time will reveal to us, what's next. But it's interesting also, you mentioned about, how the plateau of LLMs would happen, and I'm expecting, some other breakthrough in, maybe in something parallel to LLMs, which we might not
yeah,
be much aware of today. There are like other ways of also like doing things. And by the way, the whole LM comes from like one branch of the whole machine learning, so let's see
yeah,
what's happening in the other. And I'm following papers. I'm not academic by any mean, but I mean, there's a lot of things happening in parallel worlds of a parallel universe, if I might say, which also are exciting. And I'm waiting to see like how this will become like practical, similar to how the LLMs are practical in the enterprises and for startups today. Brian, really, I enjoyed the conversation. Before I let you go, final words from you and where people can get in touch.
um, yeah. So, yeah, totally agree with everything you're saying there. I think, I'm really excited about the potential breakthroughs coming up. Definitely bullish on AI overall. And thank you for having me. But yeah, if people want to get in touch, just look me up on LinkedIn. Happy to connect. And of course, Snorkel's website is a good way to find us too. And so if there's, whether it's enterprise, frontier labs, we partner with kind of all the leading companies in AI space, and are always happy to have conversations about it.
Great. And thank you again, Brian. So, for the folks who are listening or watching us, so you'll find the links in the show notes or on the description. And again, thank you, Brian, for your time. And as usual, this is how I end my episode. This is for the audience. If you just discovered us, thank you for listening or watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did so, give me a favor, subscribe and share it with your friends and colleagues. And if you are one of the people who keeps coming and you are like loyal fans to the show, thank you very much for all what you did during this year 2025. And we just about to finish the year, and we are finishing on high bars, like we are trending as usual in multiple countries on the top 200 Apple podcast charts, and this is something that cannot happen without you. And as I say always, stay tuned for a new episode very soon. Thank you. Bye bye.
Hit that subscribe button, share the show with your tech-savvy friends and fellow entrepreneurs, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. Your support means the world to us.